This is week 15, Hands-on Science, using the Van Cleve book. Also using Nicole Liam Yang's notes from Cyce Connected. We are doing number 91, Magic Solution. Today we're going to learn about how mass and volume of matter work together to form density. Let's see why it matters. So, what kind of questions might we have? Maybe, what is density? How can scientists test how much matter is in an object? What makes something sink or float? Any ideas? What have we already learned about? Do you remember what atomic mass is? It's the amount of matter in something. And how about volume? Do you remember? It's the amount of space that it takes up. So then what do we still need to find out? We need to find out, how is mass different than weight? So weight is actually based on gravity. So how much something weighs is affected by the gravity being put on it, whereas mass is not. Mass is a fixed number. So today we're going to be making a magic solution. We're going to be putting an egg into a saltwater solution and an egg into plain water. And we're going to see what happens. What do you think will happen to the eggs? Do you think one might sink? Or one might float? Or maybe one of the eggs is going to dissolve in the water? What do you think? Okay, so to do this experiment, we're going to need 2 cups. We're going to need water, salt, a tablespoon measure, a spoon to stir, and raw, as fresh as you can, eggs. Okay, 2 raw eggs that are not broken. And we're going to make a magic solution and find out what happens. Okay, all right, so we've got our 2 cups. I'm going to fill them up both the same amount of water so that we have an even thing going on here. I'm going to do 200 milliliters. Remember to measure correctly. You always want to get down low so that you're at the same level as the line that you're pouring to. So I'm just putting 200 milliliters into each cup. So I want to make sure that the egg will sink. If it's going to sink, that there's enough water in there for that to happen. All right, and then in one of the cups, so I'm going to keep that one plain water, and in this one, I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of salt. That is a lot of salt, so here we go. 1, 2, 3. And then I'm going to stir. And I want to stir for at least a minute because I want to make sure that my salt is mixed really, really well. So I'm going to use a timer because I want to make sure I get to a minute. And you could have a timer in class so that you make sure you get as long as you need to. And while I'm stirring, I just want to mention that even though the experiment calls for milk, to put a little milk in here, all the milk does is just make it look a little bit differently. It doesn't actually add anything to what we're doing, so I just skipped it because it's very obvious which one has salt in it and which one has water in it. We're not going to lose track of it because our cups aren't moving. Even if the salt were to dissolve so much that the water was clear again, which I don't think it will, we just don't need the milk. It's just easier to not mess with milk and not have to deal with having milk at CC. I got 15 more seconds. I'm stirring, stirring, stirring. You guys could take turns stirring. We're just trying to get all that salt to dissolve. Oh, and you know what? I was just looking at my notes. The milk goes into the plain water, I think, to actually make them look the same. But again, it doesn't matter if they look the same or not. So we're just going to skip that part. Okay, so my timer just went off. So I'm gonna stop stirring. Got my 2 cups. We've got our magic solution here that has all that salt in it. And then we have our plain water. So we're going to very carefully place an egg in each cup. So let's go ahead and do regular water first. It went straight to the bottom. Can you see that? Let's see what happens over here. What? The egg floats. Now your kids might say, that is boiled, it's boiled, or another one's not, but they're really not. These are both raw eggs that I just got out of my refrigerator. So, wow, why is it that that happens? What are we seeing here? We're seeing that in plain water, the egg sinks, and in the salty water, our magic solution, the egg floats. So what does all that mean? The amount of matter in an object matters. We've already learned that atoms or elements have mass, which is the measurement of how much matter is inside. We also know that when atoms join into molecules, there is space between the atoms. Remember the marbles, the jar with the marbles in it, and how there was still space and we could pour water in, or you could do sand or something? This space often gets filled with more atoms as we create mixtures and solutions, like our water and our salt water. Just like mixing marbles with sand, like I just said, the molecules sift together, squeezing more matter into a container. A second measurement needed for this experiment is volume, or the space taken up inside each cup. The volume and the mass together give us a third important measurement, density. So again, that's the volume and the mass together give us density. Density tells us how much mass or matter is squeezed into a specific volume. The more matter packed into a space, the less dense the item is. If the egg is denser than the liquid, it will sink, which is what happened here, pushing away or displacing the liquid. But if the egg is less dense than the liquid, it will float. Since the egg sank in the water solution, we know it was more dense. But since it floated in the saltwater solution, we know that the egg was less dense than the salt water. All of the salt dissolved into the water packed it with more molecules of matter. The egg did not have as much matter as the salt water within the same space, so it floated like magic. The trick to floating or sinking actually depends on the density of the liquid being displaced by an object. Imagine the egg as a duck floating on a lake. Normally, a duck can float along because its body is less dense than the water directly underneath it. But to catch a fish, the duck needs to dive in and sink. So it tilts its tail high into the air, and now its entire density is balancing on a very small circle of water. That smaller circle of water is not nearly as dense as the duck, and so the duck easily sinks and dives to catch its meal. I bet you could find a video on YouTube showing you that. There's a picture of a duck diving. That's so cool. And you can also, to learn more about density, there are things out there called density jars that you could make at home, where you carefully pour in each of these liquids in this order, and they will stay separated. This is so, so cool. I have made one of these a few years ago, but they don't last long. Because if you shake it up, you know, it won't re-separate so beautifully. But this might be a really great thing for you to try at home. That's cool. Okay, so now is a little bonus. What do you think will happen, or rather, can we get this egg to suspend in the middle of the liquid? So right now it's floating on the top. This one has sank. How could we get the egg to stay right there in the middle? What could we do? We need to change the density, right, of the water. But we need it to be kind of in between these two densities, don't we? So what can we do? Yes, we can pour out some of the salt water and add some fresh water, okay? So we're going to try and pour out about half. So we're just going to estimate. My water line right now is above the 250 a good bit. So I'm going to try and, I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm just gonna pour out some of that salt water carefully so I don't lose my egg. Let's try that, okay? And if we don't get it quite right, we'll just keep trying. So it's still floating in my salt water. I'm gonna now add fresh water. Actually, I'll add my fresh water from here, okay? So I'm gonna really carefully pour fresh water in. Remember, we're trying to get it to suspend in the middle. Boom! Look at that! It is neither sinking nor floating. Can you see that really well? Let's see. Let me just make sure. Let me raise it up. Ta-da! How cool is that? So cool! So the egg didn't dissolve. It floated and sank, and we suspended it. Density!